I crouched behind the abandoned gas station, my shoulders hunched against the evening chill as I watched the police cruiser's taillights fade down the highway. My heart was still hammering from the close call. The cops had pulled into the station on what looked like a routine patrol, and I'd barely made it around back before they spotted me. After 3 weeks on the run, I was beyond exhausted. My money was almost gone, and I hadn't slept in a real bed since fleeing my apartment in Kansas City. The backpack containing everything I owned dug into my shoulders, heavy with the few possessions I'd grabbed before disappearing. I needed a place to hide, somewhere off the grid where no one would think to look for me. As I stood up stretching my cramped legs, I noticed a weathered road sign partially hidden by overgrown weeds. Millfield, 8 miles. I'd never heard of it, which was perfect. The walk took longer than expected. By the time the small town came into view, the sun was setting, painting the cluster of buildings in orange light. Millfield wasn't much. A main street with a handful of businesses, a gas station that looked marginally better than the abandoned one I'd left behind, and scattered houses with pickup trucks parked out front. My stomach growled as I passed a small diner with a flickering open sign. The smell of fried food pulled me inside before I could think better of it. The bell above the door jingled, and a few heads turned to look at me before returning to their conversations. I slid into a booth in the corner, ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a black coffee and a side of toast, and tried to make myself invisible. 2 men in flannel shirts and worn caps sat at the counter, their voices carrying across the nearly empty diner. "Tom's already got his crew lined up for the season," the older of the 2 was saying. "Hired those same boys from last year." "What about Chad Park?" asked the other. "He's still looking for help out at his place?" "Far as I know. Can't keep nobody out there for long. Place is too isolated, and Park ain't exactly the friendly type." "Pay any good?" "Decent enough, room and board included. But like I said, nobody stays." I perked up, listening more carefully. This could be exactly what I needed. Isolated work with housing included. When the waitress came by to refill my coffee, I asked her casually, "That farm they mentioned, Park's place, you know where that is?" She raised an eyebrow. "You looking for work?" I nodded. "It's about 5 miles north of town. Take the dirt road past the old Miller property. Can't miss it. Only house out that way." She hesitated. "Mr. Park keeps to himself. Been that way for years." I thanked her and scribbled the directions on a napkin. After finishing my coffee, I paid and headed out, following the road north out of town. The 5-mile hike down the dirt road was peaceful but eerie. No cars passed me, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle from the woods that lined both sides of the road. As the sun dipped lower, I picked up my pace, not wanting to be caught on this isolated stretch after dark. Finally, the trees opened up to reveal a clearing with a farmhouse set back from the road. The place looked solid but weathered, with white paint peeling from the clapboards and a sagging front porch. Fields stretched out behind it, clearly overgrown and neglected in parts. A large red barn stood about 50 yards from the house, its paint more intact than the house's. I walked up the gravel driveway, rehearsing my story in my head. Just a drifter looking for honest work. Nothing suspicious about that. I'd been careful to shave that morning at a gas station bathroom, trying to look presentable despite my circumstances. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I climbed onto the porch. I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened to reveal a man who had to be in his 70s, though his posture showed no sign of age. He was gaunt, almost skeletal, with thin white hair and the most piercing blue eyes I'd ever seen. They seemed to look right through me, assessing everything in an instant. "Help you?" His voice was gruff, the words more statement than question. "I heard in town you might be looking for farm help," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm passing through looking for work. I'm Noah Hall." "Chad Park," he replied, not offering his hand. "What brings you to Millfield, Mr. Hall?" I gave him the story I'd prepared. Just traveling, sir. Needed a change of scenery from the city. I'm good with my hands, quick learner, not afraid of hard work. I carefully left out any mention of the charges against me, the warrant, or the 3 weeks I'd spent sleeping in abandoned buildings and under bridges. Chad studied me for what felt like minutes, his blue eyes never blinking. I fought the urge to look away. $50 a week, he finally said. Room and board included. Work starts at dawn, ends at dusk, Sundays off. It wasn't much money, but I wasn't in a position to negotiate. A roof over my head and regular meals were worth more than cash right now. That works for me, I said quickly before he could change his mind. Chad nodded once. Got any bags? Just this, I said, adjusting my backpack. He stepped aside, letting me enter. The inside of the farmhouse was clean but sparse, with furniture that looked decades old. As I crossed the threshold, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I had somewhere to stay, somewhere to hide. Kitchen's that way, Chad said, pointing down a hallway. We'll get you settled in after dinner. I nodded, following him inside. Whatever this place was, whatever work awaited me, it had to be better than constantly looking over my shoulder. At least for now, I had found a hiding place. I led Noah through the front hallway, watching as his eyes adjusted to the dim interior. The old floorboards creaked under our feet as the scent of old wood and this morning's coffee hung in the air. Kitchen's there, I said, nodding toward the doorway on the right. Living room's on the left. Noah nodded, clutching his backpack against his side as he followed me. The boy looked worn down, too thin, eyes darting around like he expected something to jump out at him. I'd seen his type before, running from something. Probably the law, but that wasn't my concern as long as whatever followed him wasn't worse than what already lived in these woods. Bathroom's down here, I continued, pointing to a narrow door at the end of the hallway. Water runs cold in the morning, gets better by afternoon. I headed up the stairs, each step protesting under my weight. The farmhouse had stood for over 100 years, and sometimes it felt like I'd been here for most of them. The second-floor hallway was short, with 3 doors, my bedroom at the far end, a storage room in the middle, and what would be Noah's room closest to the stairs. "You'll sleep here," I said, pushing open the door to reveal the small bedroom. It wasn't much, just a narrow bed with clean sheets, a wooden dresser with 3 drawers, and a small bedside table with a lamp. The walls were bare, except for a single window that looked out over the front yard, and beyond that, the edge of the forest. Noah stepped inside, dropping his backpack on the floor. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet. He ran his hand over the bedspread, and I caught the relief in his expression. Like I said, I knew his type. Probably hadn't slept in a real bed for weeks. Before he could get too comfortable, I pulled a folded piece of paper from my shirt pocket and handed it to him. "These are the rules," I said. "Read them now. Memorize them." He took the paper, unfolding it with a curious look that quickly shifted to confusion as he read aloud. Rule 1. Never go outside after dark unless I'm with you. Rule 2. Ignore any knocking sounds from the forest. Rule 3. Don't talk to the man with the lantern. Rule 4. Never sleep in the barn. Rule 5. If you hear my voice calling from the forest, it isn't me. Rule 6. Don't let the dog into the house. Noah looked up from the paper, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What is this, some kind of joke?" I stared at him, making sure he understood the weight of my next words. "These rules keep you alive on my property. Follow them, you'll be fine. Break them, you won't last the night." "But what?" "That's all you need to know for now," I cut him off. "Unpack your things. Dinner in 30 minutes. I left him standing there, still holding the paper, and headed back downstairs to the kitchen. I'd seen that look 100 times before. They all thought I was crazy at first. The ones who listened survived. The ones who didn't, well, they learned the hard way that some rules exist for a reason. In the kitchen, I put together a simple meal. beans, cornbread I'd made that morning, and some leftover ham. Nothing fancy, but filling enough after a day's work. By the time Noah came downstairs, I had 2 plates on the table and coffee brewing. He sat across from me, still looking unsettled. We ate in silence for a few minutes before he finally spoke up. "Mr. Park, about those rules." "Chad," I corrected him. "Just Chad." "Chad," he repeated. "Those rules, they don't make sense. What kind of knocking? What man with a lantern? And why would your voice be calling from the forest if it isn't you?" I took a slow bite of cornbread, chewing thoroughly before answering. This land has been in my family for generations. It has peculiarities. Things happen here that don't happen elsewhere. The rules keep you safe from those things. "What things?" Noah pressed. "You'll find out soon enough," I said. "Just remember the rules." After we finished eating, I cleared the plates and sat back down. "Your work starts tomorrow at dawn. You'll help me repair the fence on the north side. Something damaged it last week. After that, we need to clear some brush that's growing too close to the house. Tools are in the shed behind the house, not the barn. Stay out of the barn." Noah nodded, though I could tell he was still struggling with the rules. That was fine. Most did at first. They either adapted or they left, or worse. "One more thing," I added. "Every night check all doors and windows. Make sure they're locked tight. No exceptions." After dinner, Noah helped wash the dishes, then retreated to his room while I made my usual rounds of the property before sunset. I checked each lock, each window, making sure everything was secure. The sun was already dipping behind the trees as I finished, casting long shadows across the yard. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. That night I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling. From down the hall, I could hear Noah moving around in his room, probably still unpacking or maybe just too restless to sleep. Eventually, his movements stopped and the house fell silent except for the occasional creak of timber. I must have dozed off because I woke suddenly to the sound I'd been expecting. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced, coming from the direction of the tree line. I checked my watch. Midnight exactly, right on schedule. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The knocking came again, closer now, as if whatever made the sound had moved toward the house. Then again, even closer. I knew Noah must be hearing it too. For a moment, I considered checking on him, making sure he was following Rule 2. But that would only reinforce any doubts he had. No, this was his first test. He needed to pass it on his own. The knocking continued throughout the night, sometimes fading into the distance, sometimes so close it seemed to come from just outside the walls. Around 3 in the morning, it finally stopped. I drifted back to sleep, wondering if Noah had made it through his first night. At dawn, I was already in the kitchen making coffee when Noah appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, eyes ringed with dark circles. "You heard it," I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded, dropping into a chair at the table. "All night, the knocking. It kept moving around the house." "Did you look outside? Try to see what was making it?" "No," Noah said, shaking his head. "I wanted to. It was like I needed to check, but I remembered your rule." I poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him. "Good. You made the right choice." "What would have happened?" he asked, wrapping his hands around the mug. "If I'd gone to look." I looked him straight in the eye. "You'd be dead. Whatever makes that sound, it wants you to follow it. It wants you to open the door, step outside, try to find it, and if you do, you won't come back." Noah stared at me, and I could see the realization dawning on him that my rules weren't some old man's paranoia. They were survival instructions. He took a long sip of his coffee, his hand shaking slightly. "Finish your breakfast," I said, setting a plate of eggs in front of him. "We've got fence work to do." As he ate, I watched him processing what he'd experienced. The knocking was just the beginning. If he stayed, there would be more tests to come. Whether he'd passed them all remained to be seen. I threw myself into the farm work, pushing my body until muscles burned and sweat soaked through my clothes. The physical exhaustion was deliberate, anything to help me sleep through whatever made those knocking sounds at night. The north fence needed serious repair. Something had smashed through several sections, bending metal posts and snapping wooden ones like they were matchsticks. Whatever did this had to be big. As I hammered in a new fence post, I kept glancing at the red barn 50 yards away. Its doors were secured with a heavy padlock, same as yesterday and the day before. I wiped sweat from my forehead and took a drink from my water bottle. The barn was clearly important to Chad, well maintained compared to the weathered house, but always locked tight. I hadn't seen him go in or out once since I'd arrived. When Chad came to check my progress that afternoon, I decided to ask. "The fence is coming along. Should be done by tomorrow," I said, leaning on my shovel, but I was wondering if I could get into the barn. Might be some better tools in there than what's in the shed. Chad's expression hardened immediately. "Rule 4, never sleep in the barn." His voice was flat. "I wasn't planning to sleep there, just looking for tools. Rule stands as written. Stay out of the barn." He turned to walk away, then added without looking back, "The shed has everything you need." I watched him go, more curious than ever about what was inside. But I wasn't about to break his rules, not after hearing those knocks. That night, I collapsed into bed, muscles aching in a good way. I hoped exhaustion would win out over the knocking sounds. It didn't. They started around midnight, same as before, but I was too tired to do more than roll over and pull my pillow over my head. On my third night at the farm, I was sitting by my bedroom window after dinner, watching darkness settle over the property. The trees at the edge of the clearing turned into a solid black wall as the last light faded. That's when I saw it, a soft yellow glow among the trees. At first I thought it might be a flashlight, maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost. But as it emerged from the tree line, I could make out a figure carrying what looked like an old-fashioned lantern, the kind with glass panels and a metal frame. The person moved with a strange gliding quality, as if their feet barely touched the ground. When they reached the edge of the property, they stopped. The lantern swung gently, casting eerie shadows across the yard. I couldn't make out the figure's face clearly, but I felt their gaze lock onto me in my window. They raised a hand and beckoned, a clear invitation to come outside. A chill ran up my back. Rule 3, don't talk to the man with the lantern. I stayed frozen at the window, watching. The figure beckoned again, more insistently. Something about the gesture seemed compelling, like a friend urgently calling for help. My hand actually moved toward the window latch before I caught myself. The lantern man began walking slowly along the property line, never crossing it, but always keeping the light visible. Occasionally he would stop and wave again, trying to get my attention, trying to draw me out. I watched for nearly an hour as he made a complete circuit around the property before returning to the spot where he first appeared. With one final, almost angry-looking gesture, he turned and walked back into the forest. The light grew dimmer until it vanished entirely among the trees. I sat there in the darkness for a long time afterward. Even though I couldn't see anyone, I still felt watched, like eyes were fixed on me from somewhere in that pitch-black forest. The feeling didn't fade until I finally pulled the curtains closed and tried to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned what I'd seen to Chad as we ate breakfast. "I saw him last night. The man with the lantern." Chad looked up from his coffee, studying me carefully. "What did you do?" "Nothing. Stayed inside like the rules say." He nodded, a hint of approval in his expression. "You made the right choice." "What is he?" I asked. Chad took a long sip of coffee before answering. "A trap. That's the simplest way to put it. He looks harmless. Sometimes even looks like someone you know who needs help. People get curious or concerned. They go outside to investigate." "And?" and they follow the light into the woods. No one who's followed that light has ever come back. Chad's tone made it clear this wasn't a theoretical scenario. The lantern man is patient. He'll come back. Keep making the right choice. The second week at the farm brought new sounds. The knocking continued each night, but now I heard scratching against the barn walls when I worked nearby, like something with claws dragging across the wood. At night, I'd jolt awake to what sounded like footsteps on the roof overhead, moving from one end to the other with deliberate heavy steps. Worst were the voices from the forest. They started as whispers, too faint to make out words, but definitely human-sounding. As the days passed, they grew louder, more distinct. Sometimes they sounded like conversations between multiple people, other times like a single person calling out. One evening, I was chopping firewood behind the house when I heard Chad's voice shouting from the forest. "Noah, help, I'm hurt." It sounded exactly like him. The same gruff tone, the same slight drawl. The call came again, more desperate this time. "Noah, I need help. Come quick." I dropped the axe and took a step toward the trees before remembering Rule 5. Don't respond to Chad's voice calling from the forest. I turned and looked back at the house. There was Chad sitting calmly on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood. He hadn't moved, hadn't called for help. He looked up at me, expression unreadable, then went back to his carving. I picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood, trying to ignore the voice that continued calling my name from among the trees, growing increasingly angry when I didn't respond. I faced the third week at Chad's farm with a growing sense of dread. The knocking had become a nightly visitor, no longer confined to midnight but scattered throughout the dark hours. I'd wake to the sound of something scratching against the wooden siding of the house, like claws or fingernails dragging slowly across the surface. My sleep came in broken fragments. Every noise jolted me awake, the house settling, the wind moving through the trees, or worse, the actual sounds that had no natural explanation. I found myself staring at the ceiling for hours, waiting for the next round of knocks or scratches. The lantern man made more frequent appearances too. Last night I spotted him from my bedroom window standing at the edge of the property, that same old-fashioned lantern swinging gently from his hand. He remained there for nearly 3 hours, perfectly still except for the occasional beckoning gesture toward me. I kept the curtains open just enough to monitor his presence, fighting the urge to close them completely and hide. Something told me it was better to know where he was than to wonder. This morning, I dragged myself out of bed feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Chad noticed my condition at breakfast but said nothing beyond a knowing nod. The dark circles under his eyes suggested he wasn't faring much better. I spent the afternoon splitting logs behind the house, the repetitive motion of swinging the axe providing a strange comfort. The physical labor helped clear my head, even if only temporarily. Swing, crack, stack, swing, crack, stack. I fell into a rhythm that almost made me forget where I was and what happened after dark. That's when I spotted it, a dog with matted brown fur limping out from the tree line. It moved cautiously, favoring its right front leg as it approached. My first instinct was concern. The poor thing looked injured and half-starved, its ribs visible beneath the dirty coat. "Hey there," I called softly, setting down my axe. The dog stopped, ears perking up at my voice. It watched me with an intensity that made me pause. I took a step forward, and the dog resumed its approach, still limping but moving with surprising speed given its apparent injury. It followed me all the way to the back door of the farmhouse. I reached for the doorknob, then stopped. Rule 6 flashed in my mind. Don't let the dog into the house. My hand hovered over the knob as I looked down at the animal. It sat now, looking up at me with what seemed like expectation. I wanted to help it, give it shelter, clean up its wounds, maybe even keep it as a companion in this isolated place. "Sorry, buddy, I can't let you in," I said, feeling a twinge of guilt. "But I can get you something to eat." I went inside, making sure the door latched behind me, and grabbed some leftover ham from the refrigerator. I found an old plastic bowl under the sink and filled another with water. When I returned outside, the dog was still waiting, sitting exactly where I'd left it. I placed both bowls about 10 feet from the door and backed away. The dog approached the food immediately, tearing into the ham with desperate hunger. I watched from the porch steps, feeling good about helping the creature despite the rule. "At least you're getting a decent meal," I said. The dog finished every scrap of meat but didn't touch the water. It looked up at me again, then padded over to the door and began scratching lightly at the wood. "I can't, buddy. House rules." The scratching continued, growing slightly more insistent. I stayed on the porch steps, keeping my distance now. Something about the way it moved, the limp, seemingly forgotten, made me uneasy. I heard the rumble of Chad's truck coming up the drive. He'd gone into town for supplies earlier that day. The dog's head swiveled toward the sound, then back to me, its scratching at the door becoming more determined. Chad parked and climbed out of his truck, grocery bags in hand. He spotted the dog immediately and froze. "Noah," he called, his voice steady but tight. "Step away from that thing." "It's just a stray," I said, though I was already backing up. Looked hungry, so I gave it some food. Chad set the groceries down carefully on the hood of his truck. "Look at its eyes," he said, moving slowly toward the porch. I turned my attention back to the dog. In the fading evening light, I could see what Chad meant. The dog's pupils were massively dilated, far larger than they should be, leaving only the thinnest ring of color around pools of absolute darkness. And there was something else there, an awareness, an intelligence that no dog should possess. A chill ran up my back as I realized the animal hadn't panted once despite the warm evening. Not a single drop from the water bowl had been touched. "Get on the porch with me," Chad said, his voice low. I did as he instructed, climbing the steps while keeping my eyes on the creature. It watched me move, its head turning with an unnatural smoothness. Chad reached inside the door and pulled out his shotgun. The dog, or whatever it was, tracked the movement with those two dark eyes. "This isn't the first time one of them has tried this," Chad said quietly. "They know the rules too. They just look for new ways in." He aimed the shotgun at the ground near the creature and fired a warning shot. The blast echoed across the property. The thing reacted with a sound I'll never forget, part howl, part human scream. It rose on its hind legs for a moment, its front paws dangling wrong, like hands that hadn't quite formed correctly. Then it dropped back to all fours and bolted for the trees, moving with a speed and fluidity that no injured animal could manage. We watched until it disappeared into the forest. Chad lowered the shotgun, but kept it in his hands. "That's why we have Rule 6, he said simply. My stomach lurched violently. I barely made it to the side of the porch before throwing up my lunch. Wave after wave of nausea hit me as my mind struggled to process what I'd just seen. That thing had almost made it inside. I had almost let it in. "It'll be back," Chad said, helping me straighten up. "Different shape maybe, or the same one. They're persistent." I wiped my mouth with my sleeve. What would have happened if I'd let it in? Chad looked toward the darkening forest. "Nothing good," he answered. "Nothing good at all." We went inside together. Chad locked the door and checked every window while I sat at the kitchen table, still fighting waves of nausea. The food and water bowls remained outside, one empty, one untouched. "I'm sorry," I said. "I almost broke the rule." Chad nodded. "But you didn't. That's what matters." He placed the shotgun on the table between us. "Keep this close tonight." The sick feeling in my stomach wouldn't subside. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those wrong, too intelligent eyes staring back at me. I wondered what other forms they took, these things that lived in the forest. I wondered how many rules I still hadn't fully understood. I jolted awake to violent scratching sounds erupting from the barn. The noise cut through the darkness like something alive, desperate clawing against wood, frantic and urgent. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart racing as I fumbled for the flashlight I'd taken to keeping on my nightstand during my 4th week at Chad's property. The scratching paused, then resumed with greater intensity. Whatever was making that sound wasn't just scratching, it was trying to tear its way out. I swung my legs over the bed, the old springs creaking beneath me. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:15 in the morning. The scratching had taken on a rhythmic quality now, like something with purpose rather than random animal movements. After pulling on my jeans and a sweatshirt, I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the stairs, testing each step carefully to minimize noise. The old farmhouse creaked around me, but the sounds from the barn cut through everything else, harsh and insistent. I made it to the 1st floor and moved through the darkened hallway toward the kitchen, thinking I could slip out the back door for a closer look. As I entered the kitchen, a shadow moved and I nearly dropped my flashlight. "Going somewhere?" Chad's voice came from the darkness. I swung my flashlight toward the kitchen table where Chad sat, fully dressed, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. His shotgun lay across his lap. "I heard something in the barn," I said, keeping my voice low. Chad shook his head. "Don't even think about investigating. Sit down." "But—" "Sit down." His voice left no room for argument. I pulled out a chair across from him and sat, placing my flashlight on the table so its beam pointed at the ceiling, casting the room in dim, ghostly light. "What's in there?" I asked. Chad took a slow sip of his coffee. "Nothing you want to meet." The scratching from the barn grew louder, more frenzied. It sounded like multiple sets of claws now, raking against wood with enough force that I imagined splinters flying. "Shouldn't we do something?" I asked. "We are doing something. We're staying inside, following the rules." Chad's face looked haggard in the flashlight's glow, the lines around his eyes deeper than I'd seen them before. A new sound joined the scratching, a heavy thud against the barn door, then another. Something was throwing itself against the entrance. "It's going to break out," I whispered. Chad shook his head. "The barn's held for decades. It'll hold tonight." We fell into silence then, the only sounds being the occasional creak of our chairs and the persistent noises from the barn. The scratching would intensify, then fade, only to return with renewed vigor. The banging continued at irregular intervals, like something testing different points of the structure for weakness. Around 4 in the morning, the sounds changed. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a high-pitched whine underneath the scratching, but it grew louder until it was unmistakable. "Is that crying?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Chad didn't answer, but his knuckles whitened around his coffee mug. The sound was distinctly sobbing now, a human-like wailing that rose and fell in pitch. It was the sound of something in pain or profound grief, coming from inside the barn where nothing human should be. "Jesus," I breathed. "Don't listen to it," Chad said flatly. "That's how it gets to you. It sounds like a person. It's not." The sobbing continued, occasionally breaking into what sounded like words just beyond comprehension, almost English, but distorted and wrong. The hair on my arm stood on end. We remained at that kitchen table as minutes stretched into hours. Neither of us spoke much. Chad refilled his coffee once. I declined when he offered me a cup, my stomach too twisted with tension to handle caffeine. The eastern sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly around 5:30. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the kitchen windows, the sounds from the barn changed again, becoming more frantic, more desperate. Then, as the sun crested the horizon and true daylight spread across the property, the noises stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The sudden silence felt almost as unnerving as the sounds had been. Chad and I sat there for several more minutes, listening to the silence, before he finally stood up. "Get some breakfast," he said, placing his shotgun on the table. "Then we've got work to do." I nodded, too exhausted to argue. Chad looked even worse than I felt, his face ashen, dark circles under his eyes more pronounced than ever. Whatever had happened in the night had taken a toll on him. After a simple breakfast of toast and eggs that neither of us had much appetite for, I headed outside. The morning air felt clean and normal after the tension of the night. Birds sang in the trees at the edge of the property, and a light breeze rustled the tall grass. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, something had been trying to claw its way out of the barn. I walked the perimeter of the property as I did most mornings, checking fences and looking for signs of disturbance. Everything appeared normal until I approached the barn. From the outside, the red structure looked the same as always, weathered but solid, its heavy padlock still firmly in place on the door. I circled the building, looking for any external damage, but found nothing. Whatever had made those sounds had been contained inside. I remembered Chad's insistence that I never enter the barn, but after last night, my curiosity had become almost unbearable. I checked over my shoulder. Chad was nowhere in sight, probably in the house catching up on sleep. This might be my only chance. The padlock on the barn door was old but sturdy. I examined it closely, noting that despite its age, it showed signs of regular maintenance. Someone, Chad, presumably, kept it oiled and functional. But as I studied the lock, I noticed something odd. The hasp that held it to the door had been partially pulled away from the wood, as if something had been tugging at it from the inside with considerable force. I glanced back at the house again. Still no sign of Chad. Making a decision I knew might violate the spirit if not the letter of the rules, I moved to the back of the barn where I'd noticed a small window high up on the wall. It was too small for a person to fit through, but large enough to see inside if I could reach it. I dragged an old barrel over and positioned it beneath the window, then climbed up. The window was filthy with years of dust and grime, but I managed to clear a small section with my sleeve. Pressing my face to the glass, I peered inside. The barn's interior was dimly lit by the sunlight filtering through cracks in the walls and the small window I was looking through. At first glance, it appeared to be a normal barn, hay bales stacked in one corner, old farm equipment in another. But as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed the walls. Deep gouges ran from floor to ceiling in several places, long parallel scratches that had torn through the wooden planks. In some spots, the gouges were so deep I could see daylight through them where the wood had been nearly penetrated. These weren't the marks of any normal animal. Whatever had made them had claws the size of railroad spikes and the strength to drive them deep into solid oak. I was so absorbed in examining the claw marks that I almost missed the other detail. A metal ring embedded in the center of the dirt floor, attached to what looked like a trapdoor. The sound of footsteps behind me made me nearly fall off the barrel. I turned to find Chad standing there, his face a mask of controlled anger. "Get down," he said quietly. I climbed down from the barrel, feeling like a kid caught somewhere he shouldn't be. "I told you to stay out of the barn," Chad said. "I didn't go in," I pointed out, "but after last night I had to see." Chad looked tired beyond words. The lines in his face seemed to have deepened overnight, and his normally alert eyes were bloodshot and heavy. "What made those marks?" I asked. "What's in there?" Chad stared at the barn for a long moment. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with." "I heard it crying, Chad, like a person." "It's not a person," he said firmly. "Never was." "Then what is it?" Chad turned away. "You've got one more night here. Let's just get through it." I followed him back toward the house. "Is that why no one stays here long? Because of what's in the barn?" Chad stopped walking but didn't turn around. "People leave for all sorts of reasons." "The rules," I said, thinking out loud. "They're not just to keep things out. They're to keep something in, aren't they?" Chad's shoulders tensed, but he said nothing and resumed walking to the house. Throughout the day, I caught Chad checking the barn's padlock repeatedly. Each time he would test it, then stand for a moment with his hand resting on the door, as if feeling for vibrations or movement inside. He looked more worried than I'd seen him in the 4 weeks I'd been there. As evening approached, Chad became increasingly tense. He cleaned his shotgun at the kitchen table and loaded extra shells into his pockets. He handed me the revolver I'd seen him carry occasionally. "Know how to use this?" he asked. I nodded, taking the gun carefully. I didn't mention my familiarity with firearms was one of the reasons I was on the run in the first place. "Tonight might be rough," Chad said. "Last night of a cycle always is." "Cycle?" Chad hesitated. "Things get worse toward the end of a month. Then they reset, start small again. And tonight's the end of my 4th week here," I said, understanding dawning. Chad nodded. "Stay close to me. Don't look out windows any more than you have to. Don't answer if you hear voices." As darkness fell, we secured the house, checking every lock, drawing every curtain, and positioning ourselves in the living room with clear views of both the front and back doors. Chad placed oil lamps at strategic points around the room, but left them unlit. "Only if the power goes," he explained. "Light draws them." We sat in silence as night deepened around the farmhouse. The first sign that tonight would be different came just after 10 o'clock. 3 distinct knocks from the front of the house, followed immediately by 3 more from the back. "They're early," Chad muttered, tightening his grip on the shotgun. The knocking continued, but unlike previous nights, it came from multiple directions simultaneously, a disorienting pattern that made it impossible to track. The sound moved around the house in what felt like coordinated patterns, as if multiple entities were working together. Around 11, I spotted movement through a gap in the curtains, the telltale glow of the lantern man. But when I shifted to get a better look, I saw a second light at the opposite end of the property. "Chad," I whispered, "there's 2 of them." Chad moved to my side and peered through the curtain. Outside, the lantern men stood perfectly still, their lights casting eerie glows in the darkness. As we watched, a third light appeared at the side of the property. "They've never done this before," Chad said, his voice tight. The knocking intensified, now accompanied by scratching along the siding. From somewhere in the darkness came a sound I recognized, the whining of dogs, not one dog like before, but many, a pack circling the house, their nails clicking on the porch boards as they paced. "They're pulling out all the stops tonight," Chad said grimly. A dog howled, then another joined in. The sound unnaturally elongated. The lantern men began to move, walking the perimeter of the property in perfect synchronization, their lights bobbing in the darkness. The scratching at the walls grew more insistent. Something heavy threw itself against the back door with enough force to make the frame creak. Chad moved quickly to brace a chair under the doorknob while I kept watch at the front. "They've never been this aggressive," Chad said when he returned to my side. "Why now?" I asked. Chad gave me a long look. "Because you're leaving tomorrow. They know." A voice called my name from outside. Chad's voice, though Chad himself stood right beside me. Then another voice called out, this one sounding like my mother, who had died when I was 15. "Noah, honey, please come out. I've been looking for you." I felt a chill run through me. How do they know these things? Chad shook his head. "They get in your head somehow. Find what will work." The night wore on, a symphony of horrors outside our walls, knocking, scratching, familiar voices calling out lies, the pack of false dogs howling and throwing themselves against the doors and windows. The lantern men continued their slow patrol of the property line, occasionally stopping to raise their lights high, as if signaling to something in the forest beyond. Around 3 in the morning, new sounds emerged from the barn, the same violent scratching and sobbing from the previous night, but louder now, more desperate. Whatever was contained there seemed to be responding to the activity surrounding the house. "Is it working with them?" I asked, nodding toward the barn. "No," Chad said firmly. "It's different. They want it as much as they want us." We sat with our weapons ready as the hours crawled by. Neither of us spoke much, both too focused on the sounds outside, tracking movements, identifying new threats. The revolver felt heavy in my hand, a last resort I hoped not to use. The first hint of dawn brought no immediate relief. If anything, the entities outside became more frenzied as the eastern sky lightened. The knocking turned to pounding, the dogs' howls grew more human-like, and the lantern men pressed closer to the house than they'd ever ventured before. "Hold steady," Chad said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "They always push hardest at the end." The minutes stretched on, each feeling like hours as we waited for full daylight. The sobbing from the barn had reached a fever pitch, punctuated by what sounded like screams of rage or frustration. Then, as the first direct sunlight touched the farmhouse, everything stopped. The knocking ceased. The lantern men's lights winked out. The false dogs fell silent. Even the sounds from the barn died away, leaving an almost painful silence in their wake. We sat motionless for several minutes, neither of us quite believing it was over. Finally, Chad stood and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to reveal the normal sunlit farm. No figures, no lights, no pack of unnatural dogs, just the weathered barn, the overgrown fields, and the forest beyond. "We made it," Chad said, his voice rough with exhaustion. I lowered the revolver, my hand stiff from gripping it for hours. "What happens now?" "Now," Chad said, "you pack your things, and I drive you to the bus station." We looked at each other across the living room, two men who had just weathered something beyond normal understanding. Chad looked older than ever, worn down by what must have been countless nights like this one over the years. "Thank you," I said simply. Chad nodded, understanding I wasn't just thanking him for the job or the room, but for keeping me alive through 4 weeks of increasingly terrifying nights. "Get your things together," he said. "The bus leaves at noon." I watched Chad from across the breakfast table as he sipped his coffee. The morning light caught the deep lines around his eyes, making him look even older than his 70-something years. We'd survived the night, but the questions that had been building over the past month needed answers. "Why do you stay here?" I asked, breaking the silence between us. Most people would have left after experiencing even half of what happens on this property. Chad set his mug down and stared at me. His eyes, pale blue and weathered like the rest of him, seemed to be weighing something. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, birds had started their morning calls, a normal sound that felt out of place after the horrors of the night. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he got up, walked to the window, and looked out at his land. The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown fields, and beyond them, the edge of the forest stood dark and waiting. "This land," he finally said, his voice rough from lack of sleep, "has been in my family for 4 generations." I waited, letting him continue at his own pace. "My great-grandfather settled here in the 1890s, built this house with his own hands." Chad's eyes never left the tree line. He was the first to understand what lived in these woods, the first to create the rules. "And what exactly lives in these woods?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Chad turned back to face me. "I don't have a name for it, not sure it even has one, but whatever it is, whatever lives here," he gestured toward the property, "it stays contained within these boundaries." The implications of what he was saying slowly sank in. "You're not just living here, you're keeping it here." Chad nodded once. "If I leave, there's no guarantee it stays put. Might spread, might find its way to other places, other people." He returned to the table and sat down heavily. "Can't risk that." I looked at him with new understanding. The man sitting across from me wasn't just some eccentric old farmer with strange rules and a creepy property. He was a guardian, standing watch over something ancient and dangerous, something that needed to be kept contained. "The rules," I said slowly, "they're not just to keep us alive. They're a containment protocol," Chad confirmed, "refined through 4 generations of trial and error." His mouth twisted in what might have been a grim smile. "A lot of error in the early days. My grandfather lost 2 brothers before they figured out about the Lantern Man. I thought about all the rules I'd followed during my stay. Don't go out after dark. Ignore the knocking. Don't talk to the Lantern Man. Don't sleep in the barn. Don't respond to voices from the forest. Don't let the dog in. Each one wasn't just a survival tactic. They were boundaries, limits that kept whatever lived here from gaining ground, from finding new ways to escape its prison. "What's in the barn?" I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind since I'd peeked through that window. Chad's face hardened. "Something that needs to stay there." I knew that was all I'd get from him on the subject. We sat in silence for a while longer. I finished my coffee, and Chad refilled his cup. The morning light grew stronger, pushing back the shadows inch by inch. "I need to move on," I said finally. "I've saved enough to properly disappear now." Chad nodded, unsurprised. "Nobody stays more than a month, not once they understand." "I'm thinking Canada," I continued. "My record won't follow me there." It was the first time I'd openly acknowledged my status as a fugitive, but after what we'd been through together, hiding it seemed pointless. "Smart," was all Chad said. He didn't ask what I'd done, and I appreciated that. After breakfast, I went upstairs and packed my few belongings into my backpack. 4 weeks of wages minus what I'd spent on necessities in town had given me enough cash to make a real go of disappearing. No more sleeping behind abandoned gas stations or in highway rest stops. I could afford bus tickets, maybe even a cheap room, while I figured out how to cross the border. When I came back downstairs, Chad was waiting by the door with an envelope. "Your final week," he said, handing it to me. I tucked it into my pocket without counting it. Chad had never shorted me before. The drive to town was quiet. Chad's old pickup rumbled along the dirt road, kicking up dust behind us. I watched the trees thin out as we got farther from the farm, feeling the weight of that place slowly lifting from my shoulders. The bus station in Millfield was really just a convenience store with a bench outside where the regional bus stopped once a day. Chad pulled up alongside it and put the truck in park but left the engine running. "Bus comes at noon," he said, looking at his watch. "You've got 20 minutes. I nodded and opened the door. "Thanks," I said, not sure what else to say to the man who'd kept me alive for a month in a place that defied explanation. Chad looked at me for a long moment. "You followed the rules. Not everyone does." I understood what he wasn't saying. Not everyone survived. I got out of the truck and shouldered my backpack. Chad didn't drive away immediately. He watched as I bought my ticket from the store clerk, who barely looked up from her magazine. When I came back outside, Chad was still there. He gave me a single nod, then put the truck in gear and drove away, back toward his farm, back to his duty as guardian of whatever lurked in those woods. The bus arrived 10 minutes later. I climbed aboard, found a seat near the back, and watched through the window as the bus pulled away from Millfield. As we rounded a curve in the road, I caught a last glimpse of the forest-covered hills in the distance, dark against the blue sky. I shuddered, pulling my jacket tighter despite the warm day. For 4 weeks, I'd lived in a place where reality warped and bent, where knocking sounds moved through the night, where things with lanterns tried to lure me into the dark, where dogs that weren't dogs tried to trick their way inside, where voices called from the trees in perfect imitations of people I knew. For 4 weeks, I'd followed simple rules that determined whether I lived or died. I never spoke about my time on Chad Park's farm. Who would believe me? But I carried the knowledge with me that certain places exist on the fringes of human understanding, places where ancient things wait behind thin barriers, and where solitary guardians stand watch generation after generation, keeping the rest of us safe from horrors we can't comprehend.